So let's talk about the vaccine. There are two types of vaccine, and I'll talk about those specifically in a second. But the governing board that governs all vaccine recommendations in the U.S., which is called the ACIP, and it stands for the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practice, has recommended vaccine of girls at 11 to 12 years of age. Anything that falls outside of that is called a catch-up vaccine, which is why, because if you haven't gotten it when they say you should get it, then it counts as needing to catch up on it. And so for ages 13 through 26, they're recommending catching up on it if you haven't gotten it already. Let's say you're gung-ho about getting it when you're 11, and then you hear something on the news about how if you get the vaccine your head's going to fall off, and you decide not to get it, and then the next year you decide that that was a crazy report and you want to finish it. You don't have to restart. Once you've started, you can keep going, and we'll talk about what that means. And I'll say that the reason it's important, I think, to talk to somebody you trust about it, your doctor's office, listen to what they have to say. I don't give it to every 11-year-old, but I talk to every 11-year-old and their mother about it. If we decide together that, as we all know, there are different levels of maturity of 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Some parents come in and teens and they're ready to get it at age 11, and that's great. Some come in and you mention the word sex and they look at you like you have four heads, like they've almost never even heard of that. And so there's a great difference. And for girls who are not at that point yet, I think it's totally reasonable to wait. But I do encourage getting it in middle school because of what we know is going to happen down the road. And we know that we're not going to be the first ones to know about it, and that we want to be sure that all three of those vaccines are given before that first sexual encounter ever happens. It's worth thinking about and talking about with whoever provides you with your vaccines to figure out when the right time is. But unfortunately, that time is earlier than what we would like it to be. But it is important to get it done in advance. It's important to hear that HPV infections are asymptomatic, as are a lot of chlamydia infections, like Nick was talking about. My experience in talking to teenagers, if something's not falling off or they're not afraid they're dying, particularly if it involves their genitals, they're unlikely to tell anybody about it, particularly their mothers, maybe me if I really ask them 17 ways. So knowing that it's asymptomatic, we have to be very proactive about looking into the sexual background to find out if there's a risk. And like Nick said, it doesn't have to be intercourse itself. It can just be the skin-to-skin contact. And a lot of teens in particular who I've learned not to necessarily just ask if they're sexually active. We've got to talk about a lot more things to get a better idea. But it's important to know for you all that, I'm looking at you girls, that you all can get it just from being right up next to the boy. HPV is the most common STD, and it is a virus, just so that you hear that again. A virus, just like you can get a cold virus that causes a runny nose or a virus that causes a weird rash, this is a virus that causes an STD and that causes cancer. So it's becoming particularly important. And the other thing I want to point out on here, one of which things you've heard and one of which you haven't, is that almost everybody is exposed to HPV in their sexual lifetime. 80% of people is a very impressive number of people to be exposed to HPV. So not getting it is a challenge, and so having the vaccine is an amazing advance. HPV vaccines are very effective. they're effective against the strains of the vaccine that they're meant to protect against. So remember, we're talking about 75% of cervical cancer cases and 90% of genital wart cases, and we're talking about a 93 to 100% efficacy rate, which is really quite excellent. In addition, about 99% of people develop the antibodies against these viruses, which is why they're so effective. The way that vaccines work is they help your body build up an antibody against this virus, so when it sees the virus coming at it, it says, we know about you and you're not coming close. So far we know that those antibody levels, which is what we want to see to be sure that a girl is still protected, are still very high and still going to work 5 or 6 years out. So how do you choose? You come to something like this and learn about things, and we're going to talk about some of the parental and teen concerns in a second. But I recommend talking to somebody who you trust with your child's health about it, who should know a lot of answers to questions you may have, and who you trust about their opinion as to whether they recommend it. And I'm glad Nick brought this up. Talk to your teenager. We can't have enough excuses to talk to our teenagers about their sexual health. It's awkward for both parties, but there is endless research to show that talking about it is the biggest help, even though it's awkward. Talking to our kids about when they're having sex, not wanting them to have sex, what can happen if they do, is the best way for them to be knowledgeable. Even though they're going to look at you like this and do this, fiddle with their paper and pretend like they're not listening, they are actually listening to you. And you all actually want your parents to talk to you about it because you trust them, and even though it's awkward, you sort of want them to bring it up because you're sure as heck not going to bring it up with them. And don't forget that this is about prevention. When most of you have probably vaccinated your kids against things like the chicken pox and the measles and meningitis, and this is another form of prevention.